Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon for what I think to be a fantastically exciting topic. You all just got one introduction, and you can see everyone on the screen. So we're just going to dive right in and let our panel introduce themselves as they are answering their questions. So we're going to kick it off very first with Saskia. If you'll tell us a little bit about why are we here talking about natural solutions, biodiversity? Why does it matter now, and why should companies care?
Thank you. So hello, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'm Saskia Feast with Climate Impact Partners. We have been around since 1997, and we've been focused on results-based finance, so channeling finance into projects that are delivering results primarily measured in carbon impact, so carbon offsets, carbon finance, all sorts of projects there, also renewable energy. Through the development of that market and the evolution. And so we help corporates with a portfolio of offset projects, with energy attribute certificates, RECs, to cover their footprint so they can make claims of carbon neutrality or meet RE100 goals. That work involves continuing to do your own internal reductions and then compensating for what you can't deal with instruments. The reason that we're here today talking about biodiversity and biodiversity impacts is that climate change and biodiversity, while different, are inextricably linked. Climate change is the number 2 cause, I think, for, let me make sure I get this right here, it's the biggest cause of biodiversity loss in the ocean, and the second biggest cause of biodiversity loss in the ocean, and the 4th on the planet. So companies who have measured their footprints and understanding that see the intrinsic link between climate change and biodiversity. For example, loss of the rainforests, that's a prime area where there are biodiversity hotspots, is also a loss of carbon sequestration and carbon stores. So we've been able to measure that on the carbon side. Biodiversity is a lot more complicated, but companies see that their future isn't there unless they start to pay attention to this, and we're getting asked about that all the time from the clients. How can we support biodiversity, enhance biodiversity? Where should we put our money?
Fantastic, and that's where we're going to get into two of the company's side perspectives on why biodiversity matters right now. So Brian, what's driving Manulife's actions around biodiversity and natural capital? Who I should say, as well as what?
Yeah, thank you. So the introduction will help me answer the question, actually. So Manulife Investment Management is the global wealth and asset management arm of Manulife Financial Corporation. So large Toronto-based finance insurance is probably how you may know them. In the U.S., it's John Hancock Insurance, just to give context for our U.S. colleagues. In Manulife Investment Management, I'm responsible for sustainability across our private markets business. And this is what leads to the answer, at least the first part. That private markets business is inclusive of traditional private equity and credit, but also the real assets, infrastructure, real estate, timberland, and agriculture. It's in those 2 last asset classes that I have spent my career in timberland and agriculture. I'm responsible now for the gambit, but my heart lies in the natural capital assets. And our perspective on this is coming from the perspective that we're the largest manager of institutional capital, pension funds and the like, in natural capital globally. So we have about 6 million acres of forestry around the world and 500,000 acres of agriculture, which make up natural capital assets. So the question of where does this come from and why, internally and externally. Internally, it's in our DNA. So if you think about natural capital and forests and farms, it's nature, right? So we've been managing nature and its uses for 30-some years as an organization, some of the first in the business of investing in those asset classes. And so personally, I'm a wildlife biologist, sorry about that. And so, the DNA of much of the company is in kind of caring for nature, realizing that it underpins not only our business, but society, as I think the world is now becoming acutely aware of. Which leads me to the external factor of why we care. Our investors are asking increasingly, and the curve on this is very steep in terms of when They woke up to nature, realized this, whether it was from the World Economic Forum or the Dasgupta Review, that finally put the linkage between economics and the world economy and nature in the forefront. Every investor we talk to now wants to understand, what does that mean? Not just what does it mean in timber and agriculture, because they understand that's nature, but what does it mean for real estate? What does it mean for infrastructure? And what does it mean as we invest in private equity, invest in other companies? So really it's coming at us a little bit self-induced, which we welcome, but very much from our external clients and investors.
Wonderful, thank you, Brian. And Suzanne, similar question, what's brought this forward for King Arthur Baking?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Suzanne McDowell, and by a show of hands, where are my bakers in the room? Thank you. Woo, woo, woo. Thank you. So we're a company that's been around for centuries, arguably the oldest privately held food company in the country. 1790 is when we were established. So it had been, King Arthur had been in Frank Sands' family for 5 generations. And then he decided to sell it to the ESOP. When he and his wife, Brinna, decided to retire from the company, they decided to turn it into an ESOP, which means it's, shares for all the employees that work there. And then when there was an opportunity for King Arthur to become a B Corp, we did that for a CPG company to have the big B on our bags of flour, millions of bags of flour across the country. And then when we could change the way we were incorporated to become a benefit corporation, the employee owners voted to advise the trustees how to vote. That's not a shameless plug for King Arthur, although it seems like one. It's really just to say that the work we are picking up is really the work that Frank and Brinna and the owners and the founders and the legacy of their work, and we're just taking it forward. So we are always tending to all of our stakeholders, our employees, the communities that we live in, the environment, and our business, right? And we're balancing all of those. And given what we all know is happening in the country, in the world around climate crisis, significant climate events that are happening, devastating farmers, we needed to think about how we could engage in this work differently. Because it's not just about baking in the kitchen, it's really taking it back in our supply chain and getting to know our farmers. We've always done well by people, by the planet, and now this is just an opportunity for us to really think more strategically about how our brand that's been around for hundreds of years could have an impact. I'm not a farmer, but I love farmers. We've had a value at King Arthur of stewardship since I joined the organization 22 years ago, and I've had a number of different roles. Most currently, this role to elevate this work and have someone focused in the environmental side to start connecting the dots and bringing the farmers and bringing the conversations into the baking community that we are. So that's why we're interested. We're interested in healthy soil because, in fact, healthy soil is going to create healthier products, healthier grains that are growing out of the ground that are more nutritious for our consumers and our bakers to eat.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, so with that, let's start looking at how you actually do this. It sounds very positive and supportive that anyone can get behind supporting biodiversity and natural capital, but how do you actually make that happen as an institution? So Brian, I'll put this to you. How are you guys accounting for sustainable management of biodiversity?
I'll pick up on a word Suzanne used, which we really like as well, which is stewardship. I think ESG, sustainability, every other name that has been thrown out there has really replaced the notion of being good stewards. And so going back to not just our timberland and ag business, but how we do this is we actually start with how we are caring for those assets that we have invested in on behalf of the clients and being a good steward. It's a little easier to just describe in timberland and ag in the natural capital space. It's things like, we heard a little bit about this on the panel prior, it's third-party certification of our practices. So we have accountability and have a verification from auditors in what we do to nature, to the land that we're managing on behalf of our clients. But we take the same theory even in our built environment where we're looking at the gray infrastructure of a building and we're thinking about it through the lens of what's our accountability, our stewardship to the nature that is impacted by that. It might be bird strikes on a tower, right? So we have plenty of people in the community that matters, and we listen to them, and we want to be a good steward in return. And so we're thinking about, are we in a migration corridor? Do we need to do something different on that building to make sure that we understand the impacts and mitigate those impacts on nature? So it's about accountability. It's about that verification component, and making sure that we have the right frameworks in place, the programs in place that drive us to not only being good stewards of the capital that they give us, our clients, but what we do with those assets, and increasingly through the lens of climate, nature, and then the third, which we won't be talking about, but there is an intersection. We heard it earlier today: human rights, inequality, kind of the people dimension here. You can't separate the three in our view, and really it's refreshing that we have this opportunity to kind of put nature right alongside the people and the climate, which have kind of dominated this space for some time.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. And Suzanne, what is King Arthur's nature-centric transition plan? And would you mind telling us a little bit about how you're using that to implement?
Yeah, so again, back to the farmers. So our value of stewardship, we say, I think in the language you say something like, we believe in farmers and we are here to elevate the farmers. And so really putting meat behind that, and so stepping in authentically to understand farming. So traditionally with our business, kind of the grain sector, how it works is we kind of enter into those arrangements with our mill partners. And so in the last couple of years, we've asked for it to look differently, even with some of our large-scale mill partners, saying, that's great, but we actually want to go deeper into the supply chain and understand the farming that's happening in this region of eastern Texas. We want to understand what's happening with the climate in North Dakota into Minnesota in the Red River Valley range, because we want to understand because we believe we have a responsibility to help the farmers kind of elevate their work and help them farm easier. So that's been really exciting for us. And that's very unusual to kind of be, again, larger agriculture saying we want to meet the farmers, we want to understand it. How can we kind of partner with farmers to create engagement programs, whether it's to incent the farmer to farm in a regenerative agricultural way, which has been happening since the beginning of our country, but it's just getting back to those practices. So where can those practices, depending on where the farms are in the country, it's going to look very different. So we're looking at engagement programs to incent farmers to do that. Could we, in fact, elevate and bring crop consultants in? It's kind of the step before the certifications to start deepening farmers' understanding of soil and how to change inputs and practices to have healthier soil. What do they need to do this work? So for us, it's really been about meeting farmers first, which has been incredibly exciting, listening to what their needs are and their challenges, and then in an authentic way, being able to connect with them so they just don't think of us as, one of the farmers, this gentleman, Andrew Gee, that we met, we sat across the table from him, and I just remember him saying he had a bit of skepticism across his face, and he was just like, what's in it for you? And to help farmers understand how important they are to baking, and in fact, for bakers, to be able to trace back where their food is coming from, how it's grown, and how hard it is to grow it is really important. So we're continuing to learn, listen, and create programs that we can be making a difference and an impact for our farming partners and our mill partners.
Wonderful, and we'll loop back a little bit into how you get kind of that support within your organization. But before that, Saskia, what are companies coming to you and asking about around biodiversity and natural capital? What are you advising them if they haven't even gotten to these stages and they are like, I need to know this, what do I do?
How to get started, yeah. So the easiest way to get started is in the offset projects, there are industrial gas projects, there are household device projects, there are nature-based solutions. Within the nature-based solutions projects that are implemented, we can evaluate the impacts of those projects against the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think it was Sondra who was here this morning from the UN Global Compact talking about the SDGs and the 2030 goals. So many of the nature-based many offset projects, but nature-based solutions in particular, also can be evaluated on their impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals. So the two that relate to biodiversity are SDG number 14, Life on Water, and SDG number 15, Life on Land. So you can start to select projects that have a positive impact on that. So how is that impact measured? Under two of the protocols, under two of the standards, there's SD Vista or there's the global goals. And so they break down the impacts and they measure it and they verify it from a third party against, all the sub-bullets that the UN has said are important for measuring positive results on biodiversity. So that's an easy opening there, and you can go to the UN site and you can see progress on those SDGs, how much land is now covered by conservation. So really, governments can decide to conserve land. We are seeing a slight increase in the amount of land that are conserved. Conservation projects financed through carbon finance or investment from investors can also take land out so that it's going to be conserved or managed in different ways. So you can begin to see that. So that's the first step. And really, we always say you need to get engaged. You need to start putting some money into these programs. Now, a lot of biodiversity projects are enormous on scale, and it's a lot to pick off before you really understand what you're doing. So that's kind of, most of our clients don't have the assets under management that Brian's company does. And then we're engaging with the development of markets here to see, because I believe in markets having the power to scale and drive capital at scale. So if you look at climate change, we have the Paris Agreement, we have clear targets, 1.5 degrees and a net zero economy by 2050. So you can begin to map against that. Last December, I think, the UN COP on biodiversity came out with targets, 30% by 2030, 30% of land, ocean, and freshwater protected by 2030. So now there's a starting target there. There's a biodiversity credit market being built. We want to take the learnings from the carbon offset market and ensure that they are built on for this biodiversity credit market. So there's different concepts there. It's not going to be that you can trash biodiversity in one area and then buy a credit and sustain it somewhere else. It's all going to be nature positive. So it's how do you put things to rewilding, restoring, protecting areas. So I think I'll leave it there. Those are a couple of the things that we're advising companies to do.
That made me think of something I wish I'd done when we started. Let's get a show of hands. Whose company or organization is brand new to biodiversity? Brand new? Who's like, we're pros, we're protecting biodiversity, we're measuring our biodiversity impact. Okay, who's in the middle somewhere? Okay, fantastic. Well, so that gets into kind of our next question, which this was when, as we all talked about, that this panel wanted to answer, which was, where does this fall in your list of priorities? Especially as sustainability professionals, you are usually either a one-person show or you are juggling a million demands. So where does biodiversity fall, particularly, we'll start with you, Brian, in your priority list? Where should it fall, and how do you kind of maintain momentum?
Yeah, so I alluded to it earlier, which I probably won't rank the three topics that I discussed, climate, nature, and human rights, just to use the broad term, which we believe is the most encompassing. But maybe as an ecologist and a wildlife profession, I fundamentally want to put nature at the top of that priority. And I do so because if you really look at, and the reports are doing a nice job of summarizing this, if you really look at our existence, you can't have it without a functioning environment. Everything that we use, do, make, produce, comes from nature in some form or fashion. And I think we've lost sight of that, right? Climate, if we strip this really down, it's going to come down to environment and people. So while we can't ignore climate, it has to have its emphasis and its focus. It is an element of the nature agenda. We have to be positive on nature. We have to be, clean on the atmosphere relative to climate change. But the impacts of climate change are effectively impacts on nature that are going to affect us. So, from Manulife's perspective, I'm proud that they at the top of the organization have recognized this and are giving us some liberty to really put it as a top priority for the organization, as long as we don't separate it from the climate imperative as well as the people imperative.
Wonderful. Suzanne, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I love the way you say that because I think one of our taglines, I'm not a marketer, but that's what we'd call it, but it's so true, is we believe in the power of baking to restore nature and build a more equitable world, which is exactly what you're talking about, the kind of people and the environment.
Pieces.
And that's the way we are always showing up at King Arthur and more deliberately stepping into this work. So my role was created just a few years ago. Again, I've mentioned I've been at King Arthur for 22 years, and the board of directors felt like there needed to be a focus on the environmental side. I have a degree in exercise physiology. I'm not nearly as smart as probably all of you in the room in the scope of environmental science. I've learned a tremendous just the last couple of days and the last couple of years, but I have incredible passion and an ability to connect people. And I think that for us is so important about this work, is connecting farmers to millers, to bakers and things like that. So, and we have incredible partnerships along the way. It's a strategic imperative, this work. It's a newly created role, a very small but mighty team getting the work done. And in fact, it's really my role to lift this work up and bring a spotlight to it and then have it become embedded within the organization, which is well underway in the operations of our organization. So it's very important at King Arthur.
So with that, Saskia, how do you advise clients if they're saying, I just can't prioritize this, or it doesn't seem like a priority?
I have a quick,
Oh, yes, please.
Suzanne just triggered a quick thought, and that was another learning from the carbon markets on nature-based solutions. So on these conservation projects, one of the things we learned very early on, which is seemingly like a duh now, but is that it's the people who live on and use the land who know how to treat it the best. Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about where the money flows and how it's going to be implemented and how a project has to work, you have to engage them. And so you have to have climate, community, and biodiversity verification on projects that are about nature-based solutions. Mm-hmm. So how to prioritize that? In our work, we are always working on external things to corporates' mission. So we are always talking to them about, the importance. Everyone, you all have your budgets in your CSR strategies. How are you going to actually have an impact today? And what we talk about is that, the most important ton avoided is the ton that you avoid yesterday, not the ones that you're planning to remove in 2050, because we want to prevent the amount of CO2e in the atmosphere now. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be the same with biodiversity. We see this increasing loss. We've seen, I don't know if you're all fans of David Attenborough, but he's, his witness statement, when he talks about when he started, 66% of the planet was wilderness. And in 2020, I think when he wrote it, it's 33%. And we've gone from 2.2 something billion people to 7.7 billion. So we're on this very fast trajectory. Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges with biodiversity is, it's constantly evolving. Mm-hmm. So it's harder to have a real stable metric that you can take today and it's going to be the same metric in 10 years. But we have to start engaging with it and prioritizing it now and learning as we go and bringing the new tools that are coming out. So in carbon, we're seeing ratings agencies coming. We're seeing digital monitoring and verification. They're great enhancements. They need to they need to be combined with on-the-ground knowledge about that particular ecosystem, the particular community that's living there. How many mills are there? What's going on economically there? So I guess our advice and our constant conversation is, yes, do your own internal reduction strategy, but engage immediately with compensating and investing in biodiversity enhancements, because you'll learn along the way.
I think that fits in wonderfully with actually one of our first audience questions, which is kind of how do you talk about the ROI of nature-based solutions, and particularly to business leaders, how do you make that case? So I'd love to start, Suzanne, with you, and then we'll offer it to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just centered in the conversation. We just went through a strategic process where we were looking at our strategy, where have things shifted. Everybody was, sourdough baking over COVID-19, right? What has shifted? So it is squarely centered in that work. and will continue to be. So it's in fact leaders within our organization talking about it, getting out and talking about it with conferences like this. Our consumers, certainly our younger consumers, are asking for it. They're holding us accountable. They're saying, you couldn't be the baking company you are without your commitment to farming and what's happening with the climate and the environment. So we are talking about it all the time. And again, being a benefit corporation, it's about all of our stakeholders. One can't, we've got to tend to all of our stakeholders, and the environment being one of them. So it's pretty. I feel sometimes when I talk about it, it feels easy, thanks to Frank and Brenna, right? Because of the legacy that I'm standing on their shoulders, continuing to do this work. It's not easy. The plate is getting full. Being a 100% employee-owned company, there's so many stakeholders to tend to. It's not easy, but it's always part of the conversation, which is important for us.
May I
Please.
say one thing? Because so UN and World Economic Forum, they have estimated that investing in nature and increasing biodiversity will generate $10 trillion in business opportunity annually and 395 million jobs. So that's a very high level. That's not going to work with the CFO, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
That's a good one.
Well, I will say that we probably have to take a slightly different approach to ROI in my business, which is pretty rigid. And the return on investment is typically measured in dollars, and that's our struggle. I'd say fortunately, and climate helped us with this, and I do think, Saskia's pointing out where we can continue to kind of learn from that and just kind of leapfrog ahead of where we kind of floundered for 10 years. In this conversation of return on investment, we come at it from two ways. Of course, risk return is at the foundation of it, and so we always put the risk forward. And that is starting to understand the impacts of an investment on nature and quantifying that risk. We do that increasingly more formally, where we are actually underwriting factors that are associated with climate, nature, and the like. And so it's not just I think it's going to be okay for the environment. It's a factor in the underwriting that we have to score along everything else. We weight the risk factors, and that ultimately determines whether we can make an investment, because making an investment is always dependent on how much return we can generate for our clients. It's very rigid, but fortunately the organization and increasingly others are willing to put risk right alongside government risk, financial risk to entering into a country, et cetera, which are pretty typical measures. But the other more exciting opportunity here, and this one may take a little bit longer for the CFOs to get it, no offense to CFOs in the room, but that is on the opportunity side and the value side. And here, as far as I'm concerned, we can't move fast enough to start to assign value to nature. Again, you have to understand the impacts and your dependencies on it. But the minute we can start to assess this, and this is where carbon and greenhouse gases come in, what we've seen in carbon is once we know how much it is or know how much there is, and we see markets start to develop a price curve around those, you can start putting that into not trading of carbon, but putting a shadow price or an internal price on carbon. Now you've got a direct economic measure to say, I can calculate return on investment because we're going to calculate carbon at this amount. If we can get nature to the same component where we have a value and companies realize that they can put a shadow price on that value, it becomes part of the transaction internally. You want a CapEx, capital expenditure project to go in, what's the impact going to be on nature? And that impact is calculated on the amount of dollars that your internal price is. We're close to doing that. I mean, we, not Manulife, we, I think as a community are close to realizing the importance of what were externalities now need to be factored into the actual calculation. So I think ROI is going to be definitely the right way to approach it because that's how business operates. But I do think we have both the risk and the opportunity side to factor in.
Quick follow-up on that, Brian, before we go on to, because I know Saskia has some fantastic tie-ins to the carbon question as well. You and I talked about how do you do that with integrity? How do you ensure that you go beyond offsets?
Yeah. I thought I saw a question on it earlier, but maybe it fell off. So we have to also take this play out of the playbook of climate and carbon, which is we have to have the right frameworks. We have to have the right protocols. Government has to send some of these signals to us in the business community. We have to accept probably rational regulation around this to make sure that we all start from the same place to make sure that we have integrity. But then beyond that, I think organizations have to then act in a responsible way, in an integral way. And what we would say that looks like in nature is start to adopt natural capital accounting, right? So you have a protocol that is pretty well defined. The data sources are tough, but you have a means to kind of build the ledger of natural capital that are stocks and flows, just like financial. You quantify them. They can be audited. You third-party verify them. We have to transition to natural capital accounting, in our view, in order to have the credibility of that which we're talking about. If we don't have that kind of rigor behind this, the same rigor we have on the financial system, we're going to be suspect, and we're going to probably replay the last 10 years of carbon markets where you have lots of criticism, and we can't afford the time to do that, in my view.
Fantastic. Any reactions before I go into asking Saskia specifically about carbon markets? And well, then we'll dive right in. So Saskia, we've talked about, taking what we've learned about from carbon markets and applying that to biodiversity. What would that look like? What have we learned about carbon markets that would be different in biodiversity?
We've learned that we need to have transparency. We need to continuously improve. We need to, that markets do, well, I could say they do work to scale, but let's say, what do we need? 700 billion is the estimate for what we need to invest in biodiversity. The voluntary carbon market is $2 billion. There's a lot of talk about it at the moment, but it's still quite small. What we have learned is the requirement to have an independent third party set the standards so that you can measure the baseline. I see there's a question here about metrics and indicators. I think there's two different ways that we need to look at that. You need to look at how do you as an organization measure your biodiversity impact. So what's your biodiversity footprint? And that's like just baseline for nature positive. So that would mean looking at the water consumption, your energy usage, your raw materials, your land use. So that kind of biodiversity footprint is coming together now. And then you've got to think about some of the targets that you might want. And there's organizations that are doing this work at the moment. So the Science Based Targets Network is going to release a scientific methodology later this year. And then you've heard about the task force for climate-related disclosures. There's going to be one on nature-related disclosures. Those two are coming. So what we learned in carbon is to make sure that you have those stakeholders engaged, that there's review of standards and methodologies. This is publicly documented. Then there are questions and answers. So it's quite a long process to get a standard. And then those standards need to be updated as you see technology and advances come in, better measurement, better things that we can integrate. But though all of that technology coming to help, that doesn't come without people showing demand for the end product. So people showing demand for offsets, people showing demand for a biodiversity credit. So there's a couple of the things that I've learned. And then there's the requirement, Brian, you mentioned it, third-party verification. You need third-party verifiers. You need to train third-party verifiers on this stuff. So there's a lot of work to do here.
Can I jump in with adding to that, but also there was a question here on what metrics are showing up. I think my answer to the question up on the screen a minute ago is there one or two metrics for biodiversity that are starting to kind of take the lead. My view is no, and there never will be. And I say that because unlike climate change is global. Climate change can all hinge on CO2 equivalents. It's measured the same way. It's one metric, and that's why you can have a very specific target relative to climate change. Biodiversity, nature is local, and it's going to be different everywhere you go. So I think what you're going to end up with the frameworks that Saskia is talking about are going to lead you to materiality assessments. What metrics make the most sense for you? Is it water, right? Is it wildlife? Is it something else? And I think we're going to have to allow that adaptation, because if we try to set an apex target with a single metric for biodiversity, I think we ultimately fail the planet. Nature positive, in our view, is not a goal of any one organization. It's a goal of the planet. We all have to contribute to a nature positive world, but we're all going to have to contribute differently, which means we're all going to be using different metrics. We're all going to be disclosing different things, because it's going to matter on the sector that you're in. So I think we have to be very careful to not take that from the climate playbook, which is one metric, one target, because I think we'll chase our tail on that for way too long, and ultimately the planet will not be nature positive. And you know what my view is on what happens when that occurs.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. Suzanne, anything you want to add on the metrics front?
Not on the metrics front. I just have loved listening to both of my panelists here. I'm learning so much from them. And again, I think for us, the grain sector, it's not just about King Arthur. It's really kind of the whole grain sector is going to have to evolve and shift. And it is regional. It's not going to be one approach is going to fit all, and that works for us right now. I mean, King Arthur has been around for hundreds of years, right? If we're not willing to try and evolve, because as you've said, the science, everything is going to continue to evolve, and I'm just really psyched that we're part of it, right?
Well, before we close out, I have a question that would love to just get to ask all three of you, which is, what do you wish you had known when you started working in this? Or if you've been in this longer than this was a field, sustainability or biodiversity, what do you wish was known when you got started? And we'll just start over here with Saskia.
Thank you. Well, thank you for moderating. And yes, thanks for my panelists too. I wish I had known. I am a chemist by training, so I went through years of chemistry. And then I did an MBA in sustainable management and somehow got involved in this results-based finance space. And I just wish I had known it existed, because it is so much fun. The people who you meet working in this field, from our clients, from our competitors, from our partners, project developers, people on the ground in different community, there is a passion for trying to solve an issue that's deeply personal. And we apply business skills and technical skills and all of that. So I just wish I had known about that.
So you get to spread and share that off.
Yeah. Well, I feel lucky. One of my previous colleagues from Patagonia, I saw her here, and I've worked at Patagonia and King Arthur, so I feel very lucky. My entire career, I say lucky. When my mother was alive, she said to me it was intentional. So if I could back it up 20 years at King Arthur, I probably would have had the farmer at the table sooner, right? To make sure that we understood how critical farming is to baking, and that we would have been storytelling 20 years ago and making sure all of the bakers and consumers and customers understand how their food is grown. I think I would have started it 20 years ago, but we're starting it, and it's happening, and you're going to hear a lot more from us about it.
Especially that storytelling.
So I'll take the approach of what I wish was known and go back to one of my opening comments. I wish what was known is what we've now learned in the last few years about that direct linkage between our existence as society and nature. And maybe the better way to frame that is not that I wish we knew that, I wish we didn't forget it as a human species, right? And the fact that we're kind of going back to what was probably more prevalent a very long time ago is really an important element here, is to take that step back, start to ask the question, do I use or do something today that doesn't involve nature? So if you all ask yourself that later today, I'd love for you to send me a note to say you came up with something that the answer is that you don't need nature for it. Because I think that linkage is becoming clear, and I think that's what I think we all need to remember and wish we would have known it much earlier.
Thank you all so much for taking the time. Thank you everyone for being here. I would love to have a round of applause for our panelists. So thank you.